Hello, welcome to my show. My name is Bret, and today we're talking all about some Kubernetes news that came out this week, and I've got a special guest on the show. We've got Justin Cormack
Hello,
from Docker back again. Hello.
hello, hello. God, it's been a while. It's been a few months since I've been here, so it's nice to see
Yeah,
you.
yeah, we did a DockerCon thing together. We did a show in April, I think, talking
Yeah,
about um, Compose. I think some new Compose announcements in April.
yeah.
Yeah. And Justin has been at Docker. So let me talk a little bit about Justin. One of the smartest guys I know. Always has incredible depth of knowledge into things that I have no understanding of, like kernels and mainframes and just obscure tech. And so he's a great guy to have on the show because he's always got facts. But Docker is a staff engineer at Docker Inc. He's been there for at least 5 years, I think. Um,
Yep, yep.
yeah. And we used to hang out in the real world at all the Docker events because he would always travel to just everything Docker. Now we get
Yeah,
to
it
see
was
each other
fun.
like this.
Yeah.
All right, people. So this is all about questions. I have more tabs open in my browser than, and these are just the tabs I want to talk about. Like I have other browsers with tabs, but there's very little news here. And then once you start to dive in and you start to educate on what this really means, there's a ton of news, or there's a ton to talk about, I guess. Very little news, ton to talk about. So we're gonna have Justin break some of this stuff down, and let me just get through the logistics. So if you're here in the live show, ask your questions. Mostly, you can ask them anywhere, whether it's Twitch or Periscope or YouTube Live. Um, Most people hang out in YouTube Live, but totally cool on Twitch as well. We will see those. By the way, Justin, I don't know if you noticed that there's a chat button. You can actually
I
in
just saw that
yeah,
little
you can see
chat
the
button.
chat. You can't
Yeah,
reply to it.
yes.
You can't
Okay.
reply to it, but you can see it at least. Um, but so we've got, or like basically throw your questions in. We're probably going to cover a lot of it already in the conversation. Um, and I think the title for today should be "Don't Panic," essentially, which is a great quote um, from the Kubernetes blog. I think that was
And the Hitchhiker's Guide.
and Hitchhiker's Guide, the original "Don't Panic." Um, that they're essentially talking about. It sounds like there's like a bad thing here for Docker, or we're losing features, or something like that. Could we step back a minute and instead of focusing on the announcement, which maybe some people are here because they've read the tweets, could we talk about like how this all even started? Could you sort of take us back 5 years and like the origin of Kubernetes, essentially?
Yeah, so Kubernetes started off really, I mean, there were kind of two strands to Kubernetes. There was the whole stuff that was going on inside Google with Borg, which was their tool for managing what became called containers, but at the time they just kind of treated they were kind of processes and all the jobs they ran inside Google. And then there was what was going on with Docker in the open source world. And so basically, kind of Google saw what was going on with Docker and how the containers were suddenly becoming a thing that lots of people were using, and these were these were very similar to how Google had used these things, because actually Google had built C groups, which were one of the foundational resource isolation bits in the Linux kernel for containers, and so basically, Google saw that there was this amazing community building up around Docker, and they wanted to get something out that into the world that was more like Borg, so an orchestration system for containers. Back then, we used to have, I mean, Mesos was kind of big back then. A lot of people used that at large scale orchestration, but
Yeah.
large scale orchestration wasn't something that most people did or even thought about when Docker came out. People were like, Docker's cool. Docker's something I use to develop things and ship them into production the same way, but orchestration wasn't something we kind of cared about back then. But Google kind of saw, sorry, Google kind of saw that, that the kind of thing that Borg was doing was actually useful on a sort of smaller scale than the whole of Google, and maybe other people could use this. And so they built Kubernetes as a re-implementation of, or kind of rethinking of Borg in a way that was more accessible and that was built around Docker.
Right.
Um,
And that was really because Docker was so successful. I mean, and everybody was at DockerCon, right? So it was like that was the place we were all talking about this container idea. And then Kubernetes was like, well, we want to have many servers, and so we're gonna create this project. And at the time, like that was like those were the hot days of orchestration where everybody had this idea of I want a fleet of Dockers. And so Docker had Docker Swarm Classic, we had Mesa, so we had Kubernetes, and they were all a lot. I mean, well, not maybe all of them, but one of the core popular parts of it was Docker the daemon was underneath all of that. And then, and maybe tell me if this is correct, but the narrative that I remember was that we got to a point where Docker was adding so many great features for developers, and it was bundling in something called SwarmKit and just adding in all this great stuff that people were asking for. And then Kubernetes was already doing some of that, right? And it was implementing it on its own. And so it actually didn't need everything that Docker provided, the Docker daemon. And so the community basically sort of said, hey, can we get a smaller version of Docker that's more meant as the plumbing inside of Kubernetes? Is that kind of how you remember it?
that's more or less right. I think actually some of the questions about like is Docker the right thing for Kubernetes actually came earlier, because there was a big argument about CNI versus libnetwork, and
Oh
like
yeah, yeah,
how opinionated, which back in the day, that this was something we used to think about a lot, and now we don't think about it at all. That's funny. It's like, which layer of the stack should networking be done at? How should it work? And those kinds of questions. And again, like Docker was more opinionated about networking and had a kind of higher level network stack, and Kubernetes was like more pluggable and like easier to. I mean, Docker had network plugins as well, but Kubernetes like was built just around the plugin idea, and but the plugins had to do a lot more. They had to allocate IP addresses, things like that, and whereas Docker had the IP address allocation, there was all these differences. I haven't even thought about it for such a while, but so that was the
yeah.
first thing.
I totally forgot about
But
the
but
differences.
yeah, integrating Swarm and that kind of thing was the second thing as well. So basically, wasn't actually so much the community ask. It was more, I mean, like we basically sat down with Google and IBM and really had a conversation about, what could we build that's basically the right thing, both to run as the internals inside Docker and also the internals inside Kubernetes, that we could both work on and share together, and like that would have a different release cycle and different support periods, and like we decoupled from the whole Docker engine release processes and everything, and that would be the kind of thing that they would want to use in production on Google Cloud and IBM Cloud, because that was the point at which Kubernetes on cloud was suddenly starting to be an important thing that people really want to ship, and they were trying to ship it in production, and they wanted a different kind of constraints for managing out at scale and updating at scale and all those kinds of things, and like having as few moving parts as possible, and systems that were easy to understand and manage at scale. And so it's a bit confusing because there was already a little piece called Containerd at that point, but that was the
Right.
Containerd 1.0 project came out of that.
Let's do hand waving and pretend that didn't exist.
Yes. But so we launched, I think it was at the end of 2016, we announced it. We've been working on it mainly with Google and IBM, I think maybe a couple other people at the time. And so, I think we released it the end of 2016. And then like it and then I think it was in this spring, because I think I remember doing a talk at KubeCon in Berlin in early 2017, where we donated it to CNCF, which had always been the intention. But so that was, I think, that was 2017, and so that was when CNCF was still quite new, and it mostly, I think, it was one of the quite early projects in CNCF after Kubernetes itself, and I think Prometheus and maybe gRPC, a couple other things. But it was it was it was that kind of path. And yeah, Michael's baby at the start, but there's so many contributors now.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one of the things, right? Like so containerd, the idea of because at the time we always joke that Docker, the thing that you run your microservices with, is the monolith that runs those microservices. And I think someone at Docker told me that once, and it was pretty funny because we were talking about the breaking out of containerd and putting more and more effort into the plumbing of containerd. And so this, to me, like containerd from a community perspective, and of course we all have different memories and ideas of exactly how this came about. You could argue that it came about because of a bunch of complaints, but really that was, to me, the community saying, look, we want this. We want a thinner Docker that's only used as a middle ground for Kubernetes and just the bare essentials and not all the niceties that a user might need or all the extra features. And also, hey, we would like a thing that's not controlled by my one company, because we're now a multi-orchestrator world, a multi-container runtime world, or whatever at the time. And Docker, rightfully so, was saying, look, we are open source, but we still want it to be the vision we intended. So this, to me, was the middle ground. This was like
we also did want to start breaking Docker up into smaller pieces, because there was, as you say, it was very monolithic, and we wanted to, break out functionality. And containerd actually also re-implemented all the functionality with all the things we'd learned when we built Docker. And it was although there was the old bit of container, it was basically pretty much a greenfield rewrite, and everyone wanted to do that at the time. It was a bit of a risk, but everyone, I mean, particularly Michael, really understood the things that he had learned from building it the first time. It was our first real big public gRPC based project, and the API was all built around gRPC, and that was a kind of felt like a big move at the time, because Docker had been traditionally a REST API, and we wanted to move to this pattern where we use gRPC for internals and REST API still for user-facing pieces. But the gRPC stuff, things like these, which, if you've ever worked with the Docker API, streaming is kind of a bit clunky, whereas gRPC is much nicer.
Right. So essentially at the time, it was like I look at it as a win-win for everyone. It allowed Docker to pull stuff out and modularize things. It allowed you to update and modernize some of the architecture. It also allowed the same bits that Docker was using to start containers and control the cores of containers, the images and the containers themselves, that to be the same thing that Kubernetes could use, and that Kubernetes didn't have to build its own runtime that was just the pieces it wanted instead of the extra features that it didn't need. Because Kubernetes itself is already so many pieces, and it uses already so much RAM and resources on a computer just to run it. Like, I could see how everybody's like, look, I would rather not have all these optional things. I'd rather have just the minimum. So for those that are just joining, because I'm seeing that we're getting a lot of new questions and people, I'm going to throw into chat the announcements from Kubernetes. So no, it's not clickbait. Kubernetes announced they didn't technically depreciate Docker. What they did was they appreciated the shim. Depreciated. It deprecated. I'm using the wrong word. Deprecated the shim that translates Kubernetes API calls essentially for running containers. That's the middle layer between Kubernetes and Docker. And it's always been there, largely because Docker was created pre-Kubernetes, and then Kubernetes was trying to figure out how to use Docker for its own purposes. And the
history of that bit really is that, so in the beginning, Kubernetes required Docker. That was the only thing. And then at some point in late 2017, I think probably it was. Maybe it was earlier than that. People said, well, what if I don't want to use Docker? Let's have an interface that we could talk to something else instead. I think there were interfaces for things like, I remember there being a discussion about, I don't think Rocket ever shipped a CRI interface, but there was kind of, remember Rocket, things like that.
Oh yeah, I remember Rocket.
But so there was a standard API created, but because the Docker glue layer had always been there and no one really wanted to kind of touch it, that one actually basically was special case. And Kubernetes, one of the things Kubernetes has been doing very hard in the last, I don't know, 3 years maybe, has been removing everything from the core that's special case or is just an example of a generic thing. So they've been removing, it used to be that Kubernetes had all the integrations for Google Cloud built in and some of the ones for other clouds, and all that stuff's being pulled out and turned into separate projects that you just optionally use if you want them. And if you're not running on Google Cloud, you don't add the Google Cloud stuff. That's great.
Right.
And so this Docker shim process is part of the same thing. It's basically saying, oh, well, we don't need a special case anymore because we've got this generic interface. So we'll take the special case code out. So there's no special case for Docker anymore. And that's this is the kind of bit where they've said, well, we'll announce that we're going to take the special case Docker code out at some point, and we'll give you a warning if you're using it for the next release, which is coming out in a few weeks. And so I think actually maybe not, no, when is the next release coming out? In January, I think actually it's coming out I think it's after Christmas, but not before. But
120. Yeah, I don't.
Yeah. And so there'll be a warning, but they probably won't actually be removed until maybe a few more releases time. So probably towards the end of next year. And then so then there's a question like, well, what do you need to do? What do you want to do? How do you want to manage that? And so there's really a few options at this point. So one option is that, like everything else that gets pulled out, we put the CRI and CRI thing that's the same as, for example, the containerd CRI, and it's a standalone thing. And this is something that's been discussed for a bit, and
can you say that last sentence again?
We're still having. So it could be pulled out and run as a separate standalone CRI that's supported. I think there's some discussions going. There's some discussions going on right now about who might want to do that and who might support it. So we don't know if that'll happen. The other option is that people can, use containerd CRI, which is what, for example, Amazon and Google are using now, and just use that for your cluster, which is kind of, as I was saying earlier, like the original plan for containerd was that that's what you should do eventually. And we've now got like 4.5 years later, we're kind of getting to that eventually situation where people are kind of pushing in that direction. More people are using containerd, and so that's really the other kind of option around that.
Yeah. So let's I want to go through rapid fire real quick, right? Because I think that the FAQ also covers some of that stuff on the don't panic. Well, maybe not the don't panic, but the FAQ stuff's here. So one, this has nothing to do with whether or not your containers will run, right? This has nothing to do with the quality of the build or which tool can run your container. In fact, most of you may not know it, but something on your computer that you think is running Docker is actually really running containerd. If you're using micro-K8s or micro-K8s, however you want to say it, that uses containerd by default. Minikube can already run containerd. Docker itself runs
Docker
containerd.
desktop. Docker Desktop has a lot of containerd in it. It uses one containerd for running LinuxKit, and then it uses another containerd that you always get inside Docker anyway. There's a lot. We use a lot of containerd. Everyone's using a lot of containerd.
Yeah, yeah. It's like it's the plumbing that none of us users ever see, hear, or touch, and we just didn't know it was there all the time. In fact, there's a great. I'm gonna see if I can. So there's a great video. I'll put this up, a link, YouTube video from KubeCon a year and a half ago. There's actually two great videos. The first one I'll send to everyone is Phil Estes and Derek from Docker. This was actually this year. They did a great little KubeCon Europe video on basically the latest intro to Containerd, and it goes really in depth. So you can watch like the first 20 minutes, you get all of the bits of Containerd and what it's for and how it works, and then they go into like how the functions work and the actual code, and they go super deep. You've also, if you've been on this show, just go back on the YouTube history. I've had Phil on here twice talking about Containerd. So Containerd is definitely something we've talked about a lot. So I'm posting up the YouTube video for the intro to Containerd. And then here from Anna is a great video on how they went from Docker to Containerd, specifically for Kubernetes. And she goes into some details around, this is a great graphic, I think, because it shows all the different pieces in the puzzle, from the kubelet command, the kubelet that sits as an agent on every node, and how it needs these different pieces of the puzzle in order just to talk to the container. And we all may just think that Kubernetes is talking to the container directly. That's not true. In my courses, I actually say Kubernetes is not a container tool. It never controls containers. It talks to the kubelet, which then talks to Docker, which talks to Containerd, that talks to the container. And people are always confused by that because they're like, "Oh, what? Kubernetes isn't running containers?" Anyway, the container.
Make it so complicated?
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's all these things you didn't know about, because that's why you have a distribution of Kubernetes, is because it installs a lot of these pieces for you, and you don't have to worry about it. But I love the little line on the bottom that just shows how the advantage of, if we remove the shim and the Docker daemon that's already running Containerd itself, and we streamline that process, that you still get to do all of the Kubernetes things, but you have less stuff. You have less to worry about, less things in the middle, less RAM usage in theory. I know that Containerd, some of the execution things, that if Containerd runs it directly versus some of these other layers, I've seen stats that show you get microseconds back in terms of speed of applications running. So anyone else got questions in chat? Let's see if we got any here. Let me scroll up. It doesn't affect Docker and Docker.
So Docker and Docker, you can run Docker in Containerd and things like that as well. It's like, in fact, Docker Desktop runs Docker inside Containerd for reasons, but it's perfectly possible to nest it inside that. Really, the nesting of containers is really about what permissions you need inside, because you need to be relatively privileged to nest, although some of the user namespace stuff might make it easier. But generally, yeah, that stuff all works, and you can run Docker and various other things. I mean, I think one of the reasons why people run Docker and Docker, I mean, that's the kind of question, is like, why are you running Docker and Docker, and does it, what should you be doing? I think we are really keen on releasing some build tools that work without using Docker and Docker easily, because BuildKit, which is what Docker Build now uses, can talk directly to Containerd instead of talking to Docker, and it can talk to runc directly, and it has all these different running modes. And we want to release a sort of standalone version for people who are trying to build in situations where they're in CI or in Kubernetes and they're already in a container and they want to do builds, because we know that's really difficult, and we've been kind of building the tooling and the ways to do that. And so we definitely want to release an easier way of doing it, particularly like long before this like deprecation actually happens, just to make sure that people who are doing those kind of use cases, which they're using Docker and Docker now, actually have a better way of doing it. Because Docker and Docker's Jerome created it as a hack many years ago, and it's not wasn't supposed to be the way you did everything, and it's kind of slow and clunky. And so we do think we can actually do a lot better than help people move away from Docker and Docker as the way to do these things.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that sounds like a future live show. So, all right. So there's already a number. Okay, let me back it up a second and say that there's already a number of Kubernetes distributions that use Containerd as their default runtime today. So what we're really talking about, when I think about impact, right? All the people that are watching, they're like, "What's my impact?" Well, if you're running Docker desktop, there's no impact, right? Like you guys are going to keep doing what you do, and like your Kubernetes and Docker desktop will still run, and your Docker and Docker desktop will still run, right? Like all this is fine.
I mean, we still want to run the Kubernetes cluster in Docker desktop with Docker as well, using Docker, because the big advantage of that is it means that it's really easy that you can build and then immediately run your container in Kubernetes without having to worry about pushing it to a registry or any of that stuff. It's like it's already loaded in, and we want to keep whatever happens. We're going to keep that already loaded in behavior, because it's really difficult to use Kubernetes if it's not like that in desktop.
Oh, that's true, because you're right. If you build it with Docker and then you run it with Kubernetes that's running Containerd, then it's going. Those are two different image caches, right? So you would,
yeah. So we need to. We're definitely not going to break that behavior, whatever happens, because we think that's really important for the experience of using Kubernetes locally.
Okay, cool. I actually didn't think about that. I was kind of just assuming that under the hood, the kube control command line in Docker desktop would just start pointing it would point to the Kubernetes API that would then point to Containerd directly. But that makes sense, because you want one image cache and you want them to be able to use each other directly without.
And there's a few proposals around running a local registry and trying to automate that, but that's really a slow flow. So we want to just keep this shared image cache model so that just works.
Right. And then one of the questions we might get is that it may not be obvious, but you can run Kubernetes with Containerd and Docker at the same time on the same system, and they don't actually talk to each other. So, for example, in my Kubernetes mastery course, we install microcates on a Ubuntu server, and when you install that, it automatically installs Containerd as the runtime, and it runs a lot of these things as systemd services on that Linux box. And then I can go ahead if I just want to build containers and use Docker for just my on that single machine and not worry about the cluster stuff of Kubernetes, I can always just install Docker, which will have its own separate image cache, run its own container separately. And as long as you're not stepping on toes of port publishing or anything like that, it tends to just all work together. So it's funny how there's so many different ways that these tools can be used either together or separately. Yeah. Someone's pointing out. Someone's asking about Containerd versus cri-o. I have opinions, but
I have opinions too. I mean, first of all, Containerd is a graduated project in CNCF. It's in use on like the largest Kubernetes installs in the world, Amazon and Google and many other places.
Azure's about to make it default.
And so, but what's really, I mean, apart from that's kind of maturity, which I think is way more than cri-o. I think what's really exciting is like the community has been deeply involved with Containerd, and when people are doing like cutting edge experiments and cutting edge technologies and things, they are building them on Containerd. So Amazon did the Firecracker Containerd work because they're using it internally to run Firecracker VMs for running their services. And there's lots of really cool stuff going on with things like the StarGZ snapshotter, which can stream images and start running them before they're fully downloaded, which is really cool. And that's a containerd project. And there's so much work going on that people are just, people are going to containerd to do that work because it's nice to work with, and that's where the community is. That's my take on it.
Yeah, yeah. And if you look at this great graphic, which is on the containerd website, Phil and other advocates on the maintainers list have been talking about a lot of this stuff for years. And some of my favorite parts, because there's a lot to this chart, right? This is a big graphic, but it's at the top. It's real. These are really all the platforms, right? These are all the things that run Kubernetes or those tools like that. And you can see up there that they're running various things like the kubelet build kit, which is for building images. Because people realize this, but Kubernetes doesn't come out of the box with a way to build images. That's not a function of Kubernetes. It is designed to run containers out of the box. There are ways to do it on Kubernetes, and there's ways you can just do it with Docker and then push it to a registry and then have Kubernetes and download it. But those weren't like built-in native features of Kubernetes, right? It's meant as an operator tool for running production, whereas you usually build images in CI or on a developer's machine or something like that. Anyway, the things I love, the favorite part I have is down near the bottom, where the containerd shim stuff is at, because this is the cool stuff that a lot of people don't realize is that containerd can run things other than traditional OCI containers. I should say it can do other things than the default containerd can do, right? We've got Firecracker in there, gvisor. I already forgot what the heck is gvisor. The one that is like a locked down. I forget what that one.
Yeah,
does.
gvisor is the very secure implementation Google did for one of their cloud services originally, but it's basically it emulates a lot of Linux in Go code, so it's secure. So it has its own Go networking stack and things like that. So it's basically gives you a whole another isolation layer, but you can still just run normal containers. It's very cool.
Yeah. So in theory, you could have Kubernetes. It runs containerd, and containerd chooses a different runtime shim and picks, instead of its traditional default, which is runc, which most of us don't even have to worry about, right? Like, we don't even realize that this runc thing is all over the place. It's what runs our containers in Docker and Kubernetes. Like, it's actually the thing that at least from my understanding, that really kicks off your application. But there's all these other ones. I guess run HCS is the equivalent on Windows.
That's the Windows container runtime integrated with containerd.
Yeah. And then Kata, I should know this.
It's virtual machine. It's the virtual machine project that originally was Clear Containers and.
Oh, right, Clear Containers. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And some of these projects actually were in a very, very geeky thing. Like some of them actually use the containerd shim API as their piece rather than the OCI runtime API, because you've got a choice of APIs, and some people like the shim API as well. It's becoming an integration point for people.
Yeah. Yeah, and then Firecracker, that's the Amazon way to run containers, right?
In containers and VMs, it's what Fargate and Lambda are using.
Yeah, so it's like one container per VM kind of thing.
Yeah,
if I remember correctly. Yeah. So all of this stuff is a part of the containerd tooling, and I mean, I learned, I don't know, last year or something that, or maybe it was early this year when it was announced, but containerd can do some neat things like encrypt images, which I think is encrypt images. Yeah, which
I don't
have the use for that.
All these innovations are happening with containerd. I think that's what's exciting.
Yeah. So we've got this cool runtime. It has been run in a lot of places for years, including Docker itself. It's now now this depreciation of the shim is for those of us that are just running Kubernetes. It doesn't affect us if we're just running Docker stuff. It only affects people that are running a Kubernetes cluster. And for them, the way that I perceive this is if you're running a distribution or a cloud-hosted version, you do nothing. Your vendor is already chosen the runtime for you. They will manage that runtime, and if they want to change that runtime from one thing to another, that's totally up to them, and you're probably not even going to know that it happens. Is that
Yeah, I think I mean Amazon, for example, changed over the last few years, and I don't think many people noticed. I think there's a few tools that particularly monitoring tools that look for the Docker socket to monitor things sometimes, but I think all of those have been, all of those now have been fixed to know how to support containerd as well, because like so many people are using it already, so I wouldn't worry about those kind of things.
Yeah. And so if you're so to me, this is for those of you who are using what I would say maybe open source tools that are very modular, like kubeadmin, where you first have to install the runtime yourself, and you make that choice. And the Kubernetes documents for years now have shown the 3 options you get: Docker, Kubernetes or containerd, and then cri-o. Those have been traditionally the 3 options for a little bit now. And you choose one of those to install, and then you have something like kubeadmin install all the other things like kubelet and kubeproxy and the API and the scheduler, blah, blah, blah. So to me, those are the people that are the only ones that really need to read this. And that is such a small portion, right? Because when we talk about everyone running Docker Desktop, Minikube, Microcates, Rancher, Docker Enterprise, VMware stuff, any of the cloud provided ones, like all those people, their decision was made for them. They didn't realize it maybe, but it was made for them, and those things are provided. I think Rancher has a little bit of flexibility there, and I know that or Minikube rather, has an option that you can use containerd instead of the default Docker. So we're
Yeah,
really
I mean,
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I think most Kubernetes distros make one choice because it's easier for them to maintain, but yeah, the more sort of hands-on they are, the more choices you might get behind the scenes, or you can often just tweak the config and things like that just to override the choices that they've made, because Kubernetes is, a modular plug and play kind of system where you can build it up out of the bits you want.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at kubeadmin, I think of that as a very unopinionated, like Kubernetes itself, a very unopinionated tool that's just helping to automate the installation, but you still have to make certain decisions, like your networking and storage, as well as runtime.
Yeah,
And
that's
yeah.
what Docker Desktop uses under the hood, for example.
Oh,
But we don't expose any of the options to the user.
right,
Basically,
right.
we make all those choices.
And that's one of the differences in this community too, is that if anyone out there is taking my Docker Mastery course and you've looked at the differences between Docker and Kubernetes, Docker comes out of the box as an opinionated tool, which is what so many people love about it. It makes it easy to use. It's a single command line for so many different things. And then Kubernetes has taken the complete opposite approach of, we're very modular. We don't even provide, unless you consider kubeadmin, we don't even provide a built-in way to just automatically install it. And you can have many opinions on how to use it. And so, like, people will notice in my courses that I have my own opinions on how you should use it. I'm a very, very GitOps approach, automated CI/CD, and a lot of the things in Kubernetes you don't need for that. So yeah, so I teach it opinionated, which I think is very helpful, because if you want to read an unopinionated way of Kubernetes, go read the docs. Like, the docs are very great at describing all the various things you can do, and you may only need like 20% of that or 50% of that. So hopefully that helps people. Hopefully my opinions are okay or work for people. All right, let's look at some questions. Go ahead. I'm going to look
There's
at
some questions
while you're talking.
about Mirantis, just about Mirantis container runtime, or what is it? So Mirantis container runtime is basically the continuation of the Docker enterprise engine. So it's basically Docker with the same enhancements, but it's not just not called Docker anymore, because the after the 1 year split with Mirantis, the agreement was that Mirantis would go back to using their own names again. But it's not changed. They're carrying on using the Docker the same as there may be projects in the same way as they were to build the same thing, and so they're not changing. It's not a change it's just it's a name change, not a content change, not a software change.
Good point. Yeah, naming is hard, and is in the community of container tooling over the last 7 plus 8, almost 8 years. Yes, names are hard and they constantly change and are confusing. Like, yeah. The only names that haven't changed, I think, are the word Docker and the word Kubernetes. So here's another question. Should we consider moving away from Docker and Swarm in production, as I'm not Kubernetes user yet? No, this has nothing to do with that. And you should feel just as confident as yesterday in this. From my point of view, the story I'm telling on Twitter is this is all going according to plan. This plan was started when Containerd was announced and given the CNCF by Docker. If you go look at the maintainers list, most of those people on the Containerd list are either former or current Docker employees or Docker community leaders back in the heyday of Docker development, when it was, sort of the only and main tool we had in Containerland. So this is all fine. Like, we knew this was happening. It's not a shocker. It doesn't impact Swarm at all. It doesn't impact Docker command line or Docker features or the Docker daemon at all. Docker, and there was actual great tweet that someone said, does Docker not care? Are they not going to be CRI compliant? And that to me, that's like a communication challenge, right? Like, that's like, how do we communicate this, that this is not Docker intentionally snubbing Kubernetes? This is not Docker ignoring Kubernetes. Like, you and I have kind of wrapped this up, but I'm trying to figure out, how do I do that in a tweet? So I end up tweeting a lot. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
Keep doing what you're doing. And Biker says, I'd like to keep using Swarm, at least for now. Yeah, absolutely. As far as we know, Mirantis continues to say they're supporting Swarm. Like, they keep saying that. So, we're just about to get, which I mentioned on the show the other week, we're about to get a new release of Docker 20.10, right? Yeah. And it's going to have new Swarm features in it. It's going to have Swarm jobs finally, which we saw as a PR at the beginning of the year. So, yay. You Swarm people, you getting jobs now.
Jobs are good.
And if you need cron jobs, I think we have Crazy Max on the chat today. So go check out Crazy Max's Swarm jobs, which is an add-on for Swarm that can do jobs and cron jobs.
Hi, Crazy Max.
Yeah, throw the link to that, Crazy Max. Can you throw that in the chat so people, if they're on Swarm, they can check out Swarm jobs? Let's see what else. Someone's saying AKS version 1.19 uses Containerd. I just saw an announcement weeks ago from Microsoft that Azure will start using, for all of their automated Kubernetes things, they'll start using Containerd. It's, I think, with 119, maybe 120. By the way, we didn't say this yet, but with 120, that doesn't mean anything. Like, Docker won't stop working in 120. In fact, Kubernetes project is only, what they're saying right now is that it will work, at least the shim will be officially supported at least as far as 122, I think. So we're talking a year from now before anything really potentially could happen. Like, it may not even happen.
And then even then, like, that's it not being built in, but it could be. I mean, I think it, as I said, there are people looking at supporting it externally so that you can just run it separately, which me as well. So there's been Dims did a proof of concept pulling the code out thing, which was kind of cool. So it's like there's a few people, as I said, we're in discussions with people about potentially what might happen there. So then, in which case it'll just be an external config instead of an internal config.
Same, yes. 170 some people watching, broke my record. So this is actually a great question too on Sam asking how does this change going to affect us? Can we still be able to build Docker images and use the same K8s? It's just the backend part, which is running these images, that are changing. Will it break anything? My short answer, I think, is no.
Yeah, nothing
So
will
that
change. Nothing will break. All images run. I think the image format has been part of OCI for a long time. We set up OCI to standardize these low-level. So OCI is basically an organization in the Linux Foundation that basically the Open Container Initiative, which is a standardization organization that Docker set up in 2015, 2016. I think it was that long ago anyway. And that basically defines what container images look like. And we all sit around on Wednesdays, and we sit there and discuss like changes to these things and how they work. And if we find problems, like we've actually found some problems while we're testing Docker 2010 at the moment, that it couldn't pull images from the old GitHub registry and a GitLab tool. And we're like, well, we need to find out what's wrong. These things are not fully conforming to the spec, but we don't want to break them anyway. So we're looking into how to fix that and things like that. So basically these standards for images and the tooling for building them and things has all been very heavily standardized for a long time. And so every image that you build with Docker can run in every container runtime that exists. And every other tool can build because these are standards, and people can implement new runtimes and new variations. And there's a process for rolling out stuff and working out how to roll out new changes to these things if people do want to make changes. But actually, they change very slowly. I think, we've made the things like multi-arch images and a few other changes, but it's been it's a slow and very careful compatibility process that we go through with all these things. So everything is compatible with everything else in the ecosystem.
nice.
So sorry about
No,
speaking too fast.
No, it's good. I mean, but that's why I was excited that you could jump on last minute, because there's so much going on here, and I get a lot of this wrong because I'm old and my memory fades, so I remember things wrong. And there's so many other people that are involved with this stuff day to day, and there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's a lot of complexity that most of us users never have to worry about when it comes to the command we type and then the container actually running, right? So I will mention that if those of you that are interested in this, there is the Docker community Slack, so you can go check that out. But I also now run a DevOps Discord server. So we've been talking about that a lot today. Actually, I've been dumping as much information as I can in there, as well as on Twitter. So either follow my Twitter feed, or I recommend jumping into the free Discord. That is at devops.fan. Actually, let me just bring that up.
I need to sign up to your Discord. I haven't got around to it.
Yeah, devops.fan, and you can get a free account. The nice thing is, unlike Slack, is it doesn't delete messages. We get lots of cool emojis built in, and you can do voice and video channels and all the stuff that's meant for an open community. You can actually get special access to roles and channels if you become a patron, which I did not mention in this show. But if you want to check out me on Patreon, check out the links below, and you can. Anyway, we have tons of people in the chat, and yeah, I think we're almost at 1,000 people. So we just had that up a couple of months, and we hang out in there every day and chit chat about not just containers, but all things DevOps. Whereas the Slack I have, which we just passed 35,000 people in that Slack, so the chat messages only hang around for like a month in that. And that's a problem. But that Slack had been really just about the courses mostly, and not a whole lot of chatter about the larger world of DevOps. And so for years I'd been wanting to use Discord, but Discord up until this year had been really focused on gaming. And then finally this year they kind of pivoted and said, hey, we're going to be about open communities. So I'm telling everybody that this is the new IRC, right? Because I hated Slack for that IRC world approach, because there was no moderation, there was no banning, there was really none of that, and there was no safety and security kind of stuff. But we have all that in Discord now, so yay. So yeah, everybody check that out. Back to the show.
There's a comment about everyone losing their mind about 120 deprecation, but everyone's actually running much older versions. It is true. Yeah. There was a lot of stats saying that the most popular Kubernetes version at the moment is 115. Which was released a couple of years ago, I think, if not 3 years ago. It's like, so people have not been upgrading Kubernetes. it's because Kubernetes has got a lot more stable, and people are like, well, I don't really need to upgrade. Upgrading is always a high risk activity, and I mean, the security people always tell you to upgrade, and the the people who want you to use their nice new feature they shipped want you to upgrade. But there's a lot of value in the existing versions of Kubernetes that is sitting there and just working in your infrastructure. And I know I work in security, and I always tell people to upgrade, but I understand why they don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I have clients on this. We could go down this rabbit hole for a long time, but it's like I work with companies on implementing Docker and Kubernetes, and one of the habits is when they're not used to this cloud native infrastructure, everything's disposable. I need to, I need to build in redeployment from scratch, like as a part of the feature, as a part of my thing. So I have to constantly nudge them and say, hey, what if I delete that server? What if I delete this cluster? How can you rebuild it? How fast can you rebuild it? Because it's not ingrained in so many people's heads that I need to upgrade. I need to be able to replace things. And if they do that, then these upgrades become much easier because they're not so worried that they've had this Kubernetes cluster for 3 or 4 years. They've upgraded it in place every time because they don't know how to migrate or to replace or whatever. Yeah. So I would say with anyone out there doing Kubernetes, like make this a part of your as a feature of your deployment is that you can replace a deployment.
I was going through some Docker Hub logs to see which Docker versions people were using, because the question about whether we could deprecate some really, really old compatibility code. And I found someone who pulled a container like a few weeks ago using Docker 1.1, released in 2014, and
wow.
still running Python in so I looked up the IP address, and it's a very large corporation in the sort of top 100 corporations. Like, people are not upgrading stuff if it works.
Yeah, I mean, and we all have so many things now to I'm gonna put our Twitter handles on the screen here because in case people want to ask more questions, because Justin is on the Twitters, and anyway, I was going to mention that this thread, I threw it into chat, so check out the chat link. This is a really great thread started by Kat Cosgrove, which I was lucky enough to be on a live show with during KubeCon. So hello, Kat. And it was a great thread. Her audience is operators, which are Kubernetes people, and the thread buried the lead for developers at the very end of the thread, not to her fault, because her audience and her friends are mostly operators. They don't necessarily care so much about building images on servers and running dev stuff. But she mentions that all the details, and it's a really great thread. And then at the very bottom, people start asking about, well, how do I build, what about Docker on my local machine, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, oh, yeah, all that's fine. Like, yeah, sure. All that's great. Nothing's changed. And
yeah, I mean, that's
great.
That's the big message is, for developers, nothing changes, and pretty much for everyone, nothing changes unless you're really building your own Kubernetes, in which case you need to tweak it a little.
Right. All right, I'm going to put your Twitter up there. What haven't we covered? Let me look at all these tabs that I have. The tabs. Let's talk a little bit about. So there are edge cases. There are edge cases where, as of today, Containerd might not do everything that Docker does in a Kubernetes cluster. And I'm not putting you on the spot because you may not know all of them. But if you could think of any, one of them I know is this roadmap for Windows containers, and we may have some people on the chat that care about Windows containers, and this is specifically what we call WCOW or WCOW, or however you want to say it. Windows containers running natively on Windows, and traditionally this is run Docker-D on a Windows server. Containerd wants to support it, but I'm not really sure that it's fully vetted. I'm not sure what the status is. I don't know if you know.
know exactly what the status is. There has been Microsoft's been doing a lot of work. To support that, and they very much want it to work, because what happened, the history was that we agreed that the work on Windows containers was kind of having time as the work on Containerd, and we said to Microsoft, okay, you can put in a Windows container version into Docker as a temporary thing, but you have to move it to Containerd later. And like all these things, later's a lot later, and so it's been a kind of slow process. And my assumption is that the Windows Containerd stuff should be GA before this deprecation actually happens, but because I mean, I don't think Kubernetes, because Windows containers are a feature of Kubernetes, I don't think they can't break that. So I think they have to provide a route, and they won't. They don't want to break something as substantial as like Windows containers don't work anymore. But again, if there was an external implementation of Docker shim, that might be an option for Windows containers as well. But I'm fairly sure that the Containerd stuff is pretty close now. But I just haven't been following the details, so I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, it's always been so if we go back a minute, if you're someone who cares about Windows containers, there was a time where Docker could run, for years really, Docker could run containers on Windows containers on Windows, and Kubernetes didn't support it yet. Then it's a few years ago, at least, Docker announced that if your Docker is your runtime on Windows for Kubernetes, that Kubernetes could run on Windows, and then Kubernetes itself became stable or marked stable at some point for running Windows containers on Windows as long as you were using Docker. And now the last piece of this is also supporting Containerd as the runtime on Windows nodes in a Kubernetes cluster. Does that sound right? Do I have the historical steps there? Yeah. So, and again, 120 isn't out yet. None of this even changes in code until 122 at minimum. We're still talking about stuff that's a year away from anyone having to change a bit on their servers. For those of you that are just joining, let's see what else we got. I love that, though. Thanks, Eric. That was a great comment. Losing their minds.
There's a question about, does it affect the container network in any way? And the answer is no, because Kubernetes never used Docker's networking, even on the beginning. And so absolutely nothing changes there at all. It's like they never use Docker networking.
Yeah. And that's why we have the CNI thing in the Kubernetes world, where they created a spec of sorts that allowed all these different networking vendors to plug in, and also why it's one of the things that it makes Kubernetes more modular. But because it's not out of the box like Docker provides, and it's not automatic, it also adds complexity, just like the storage stuff and everything else. So it's one of the pluses and minuses and pros and cons of the two tools if you're trying to consider what do I use. There's another question here or actually it's a comment. George is saying, I just took the CKA training and Docker runtime was used as default. And I would say that's probably true of a lot of training, because Docker is still 70% or so of the ecosystem in terms of what runs your thing in Kubernetes. If you're running Kubernetes, I think the last stat I saw was from Phil on an I don't know, some survey or whatever. I don't know if it was CNCF survey or Sysdig survey or whatever it was, but somebody did an analysis, and this was probably a year and a half ago, but it was like 70% Docker, 20-some percent Containerd, and then like 3% cri-o or something, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely what I've seen in surveys. I don't know how that corresponds to numbers, because Amazon runs quite a lot of them, and it's like they probably would. They probably didn't fill in the survey, but I mean, I do think that there are a lot of people using Docker. It's not technically the default because Kubernetes doesn't do defaults, but it kind of is because it was the only built-in one, and so it was kind of easier to install. But it's really no more difficult to install anything else now as well when you're installing it yourself.
Yeah. 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 Eric's putting in a link. Make sure that works. Sometimes links are blocked, so sorry about that. Yeah, I don't see it.
So someone says they're using .NET Core and converting to running on Linux rather than Windows. I actually see quite a lot of people doing that. It reminds me of when people started running Java in production many years ago, and it was like you can run anywhere, and then eventually in production everyone run it on Linux. And I think that's happening a little bit with .NET as well. And Microsoft are supporting Linux really, as a first class thing with .NET Core to let you do that. And I think it's a good strategy especially if you're only running Windows nodes to run .NET Core applications and you're running them for other things. It's simpler.
Yeah. Oh, there's Wart from Discord. Hey, what's up? It's one of the people I've been talking with all day today because they too were like, "What? What does this mean?" It's only
it doesn't mean anything different for developers. That's the key thing to remember.
Right. The key takeaways are operators. If you're building your own custom clusters, you will have to care. Otherwise, you don't. Developers don't care. Like there's really probably of all the container running people in the world, I'm going to just throw out a random number. There's 5% that might care or need to care. Or if you're just curious, and of course, a lot of people on this show, they may not have to care, but they're very curious and they want to understand how their systems work. And that's the challenge of Kubernetes is to figure out all these parts and how they all work together. And if someone gave me a big chart of all the different pieces of that puzzle, including all of these different parts to the runtime, because I usually when I'm showing a graph, it's like I show the node and I show kubelet and kube proxy, and I don't even mention. I might throw the Docker logo in there, but I don't even mention all these different binaries that are driving down that stack. But there's definitely more than a few things there.
Well, yeah, and Kubernetes is successful because it is that kind of system that you can extend and build and customize, and that's why it's so successful. And I think Docker's successful because it helps developers do things really. I mean, Docker's an ease of use tool, not a really complicated tool, and everyone loves that about it.
Yeah. That Eric's also saying I think the majority of developers that might care would be these rolling their own clusters in home labs, but in work situations probably not. And that's true. That would matter if you're using kubeadmin. So if you're someone who's ever tried a tool that's more of an open source, low level tool for building your own clusters in Kubernetes, kubeadmin. It's kind of the default, I would say. If you're just going pure open source, what we call the upstream vanilla version of Kubernetes. But if you're in my courses and you're using something like Docker Desktop, microcates, Minikube, like those all make the choice for you, so there's no worry and concern there. And then if you're using something like Rancher because you're interested in open source distributions, there's many of them now, but Rancher is one of them that I talk about a lot. You don't have to worry about there because they're going to help you with that decision. I think, as far as I know, they support both. But
most of these tools do actually support that because they just support customizing Kubernetes because that's part of what you need to do with Kubernetes if you're doing complicated things. So there's often a way to change these things in everything if you want to. And it's a good way of learning about how these things fit together and playing around with them as well.
What about OpenShift? All right, well, OpenShift already uses cri-o, so it doesn't get impacted by this at all, which cri-o is the alternate to containerd. It's the It's the one run by Red Hat, but it's an open source project. It's a little bit different than Containerd in terms that it's versioned only, I believe, with every with Kubernetes versions, and it's
it's very. I mean, it's called cri-o because it just does CRI, and their kind of pitch with it was like, we want something that's just for CRI. Whereas Containerd is like, you can use it for loads of things. It's really flexible, but it also has the CRI built in now. Originally, it was CRI Containerd was a separate project, but they merged, and you can just build it in, and that's great. But yes,
that was
Containerd is really a sort of toolkit where you can build all sorts of other things. So we built it into LinuxKit, which is the operating system inside Docker Desktop and things like that. So there's lots of cool things that you can do with Containerd as well, and I think that's really good.
So I haven't stared at the code all day and all the features, but I definitely would consider Containerd a superset of features to cri-o, and that's the thing, that cri-o is not trying to be all things to everyone. It's specifically only for Kubernetes. Like it's very narrowly scoped like that. So if you're only trying to run OpenShift, then you really just have to care about cri-o. And cri-o is the one, like, if you were buying OpenShift support,
if you're running OpenShift, you don't have to care about cri-o, because you don't get any choice. It's part of OpenShift. You care about OpenShift and the OpenShift tooling, and that Red Hat's giving you that whole packaged system, and that's. But you won't. You can still build your containers with Docker build, and they still work on OpenShift because of the standards all the way up through everything.
Yeah. All right. So we've been talking for an hour, over an hour actually. So if you're just joining us, or if you've only been here for a few minutes and you've missed a lot of it, go back to the YouTube. You can go to Bret.live. It's up at the center here. Bret.live will get you to this channel essentially on YouTube, and you can watch this whole video and replay all the chat and see all the links and all that stuff. If you're here watching live, this is your last chance to get questions in before we've got to let Justin run. We're talking about Kubernetes and its change of saying that the Docker shim, or the layer between Kubernetes and Docker for Docker as a runtime, is going to be deprecated here in it's a little bit, maybe a month or two, and then eventually over time, at least a year, we're going to start to see Kubernetes versions that the Kubernetes team is not maintaining that shim. But the summary here for those of us just joining is, if you're a developer, nothing changes, nothing matters, everything's compatible. Keep using your Docker Desktop, keep building your images with Jenkins, whatever you do, and they'll just run fine on Kubernetes. If you're an operator, the only time you actually have to care is if you're building your own custom clusters from the upstream Kubernetes with something like kubeadmin. If you're using any of the distributions, they already make this choice for you. At least almost all the ones I've seen make that decision about this runtime, and it's really a low-level API that is changing. It's not that Docker itself is affected, or that the Docker team is going to change the way they're doing anything. It's really two different goals, two different things. So yeah, what do we got? Last minute questions. Biker saying,
there was a question about Will Rancher after they joined Susie. Be pressured shipping cri-o, and it's like, no one has ever managed to pressure Darren into doing anything he doesn't want to do. So I don't see any change there.
Yeah, if they did, then he would just build another one and open source it and then use that, right?
Then there was a question about Raspberry Pi, and it's like, again, if you're building a cluster on a Raspberry Pi, well, nothing's changed now anyway, and it doesn't change, but Raspberry Pi is just like anywhere else, and everything works great on ARM. We're looking forward to releasing a Docker desktop on ARM Mac. I switched over to using an ARM Mac now. I've got ARM Mac, ARM Windows, and a Raspberry Pi, so I have ARM all the things now.
Holy cow!
I had to go and dig out an Intel box the other day to build a container for Intel.
Are you on the show from an ARM machine?
I actually switched temporarily to my Intel one because the camera was being a little bit weird on the ARM machine. I didn't want to risk it, but I've been using it as my day-to-day machine for the last
Yeah.
week or so
Yeah, you're
now.
using
And
well, and you're
it's,
using a Logitech camera, so we got to wait on Logitech to get all their M1 stuff out.
well, look, it works, but sometimes it's been freezing, and I've been like, I don't want to risk this.
Right, that's true. That's true. We don't freezing on the internet is no fun. Well, that's cool. That's cool. I'm excited. I have yet to click the buy button on an M1, but it's pending. Like it's probably next. It's probably this month. This is December. I'm probably. I actually have to turn in an old MacBook of mine that I've leased, and I'm so close to hitting the M1 button. There's a couple of apps I use that don't yet have M1 support, or at least are having problems themselves with Big Sur. But I'm so close. Like what I can't wait for is battery life and no fans. Like that. That is my thing.
Yeah,
Like that's my jam.
yeah, I've got the Air because like my old MacBook was my fanless machine, and it's like 5 years old, and the
Oh, I love
battery's
that
dead, and
thing.
like this one is just amazing.
I
Yeah.
love that little 12-inch
So
thing.
yeah,
I had one of those. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's a good
What is the most
replacement.
mature? All right. So we're gonna before we chit chat about all that stuff, let's make sure we got these questions. What is the most mature and stable container runtime solution to replace Docker Blob? Container D.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
graduated CNCF project, and it's very stable, very mature, and all you know, all the big clouds are using it. It's
Yep. Lamork, if you just joined, we explained all that in the last hour, but the short version here is the difference between Docker and Container D is Container D is being used by Docker today. It runs all your containers. And so when you run Docker CLI on your machine, it talks to Docker, the daemon, that starts up Container D for that container, and away you go. Kubernetes for years has supported Container D as a runtime. So there's nothing that's really different there. It's all the same stuff. And Podman is another way to run a container, but it's not related to CRI or Containerd. It uses something called systemd on Linux to start containers. So it's an alternative, I guess you could say, on a single machine for a user to start a container rather than using Docker. Containerd has a CLI, by the way, but it's not really meant for day-to-day use. That's what Docker's for. So Containerd wasn't trying to replace Docker. It was simply trying to automate some of the low-level stuff and then gives sort of this low-level functioning tool that at least allows you to pull some stuff out of its API from a command line. But it's certainly not as convenient as the Docker commands, and doesn't have as near as much functionality in the CLI as Docker. So anyway, that was a lot. I just said a lot. Sorry.
So there was another question about Docker and Docker, which we did talk about earlier, and the answer is you can still run Docker and Containerd and things like that. And but as I said, we really want to help people with good solutions for doing this. It shouldn't affect anyone. It's not going to affect anyone in the short term. It's not going to affect most things, but we know that there are use cases where this is really important, and it's kind of difficult now, but we're definitely going to work on making that better, but it shouldn't affect it anyway.
Yeah.
But you probably don't want to run.
Oh, okay. So you broke up for a second. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, sorry. I my internet's not having a good day.
That's okay. So you said Docker and Docker. So basically, what we're talking now about is Docker and Containerd, right?
Yeah,
Oh.
and so Docker and Containerd works fine, but yeah, as I said, like it's if you're if you're using it in there, you can still run Docker and Containerd and things like that as well. I mean, it's all those things do work nested, so there shouldn't really be any problems doing that. And you may well actually be, running these things like that already without even realizing some of the time. But
Cool.
you won't be able to get you won't be able to share the host Docker socket from the actual Kubernetes cluster you're running on, but you probably weren't allowed to do that anyway. You're probably running a separate Docker daemon for doing that.
Right. Well, and that's the thing is when we talked, there was a question earlier too about CI, and we could have a whole episode talking about Docker and Kubernetes and CI, like how a lot of people now that they're getting comfortable with Kubernetes, they're wanting to build their containers and run their CI in a Kubernetes cluster. Makes total sense. And instead of having a bunch of dedicated agent nodes for their CI platform agents, like just do all this as containers they're spinning up and building other containers, and all that makes great sense. But typically, I would not advise, like you're saying, I would not advise people to run Docker on the host. And even if it's the Kubernetes runtime or whether it's not irrelevant, I would not necessarily want my Kubernetes containers to then have basically privileged mode to get back to the host to mount the socket and control Docker. Essentially, that gives them root. So I would always
But it
prefer
also
some.
gives them the ability to break the host by mistake by
Yeah.
removing other container, things like that, which is like a recipe for messing up your build system at the worst possible time. So
Yeah. You want to isolate it. You definitely want to isolate your build.
Yeah. But yeah, we should have another episode talking about the CI problems. That would be good.
Yeah, there's multiple ways to do it. Actually, there's a great video from DockerCon if anybody's curious about CI in containers and how you do that, and the model of like Docker in Docker or Docker out of Docker or whatever. Look up on YouTube. There's a DockerCon 2019 video from Laura Taco, and I forget who else she's doing it with. And it's about it's basically look up CI in containers or something like that, and with the words Laura Taco, Tacho, DockerCon 2019. I remember watching that and thinking it was really great because they had visualizations of showing the different options for Docker in Docker, Docker out of Docker, Docker on Kubernetes, all that stuff. So there's multiple ways to do it, and there's pros and cons to every one of them. So it's complicated. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Justin. Before we go, everybody knows about our Twitter handle, so go check us on Twitter. We talked about the DevOps fan. That's over there. DevOps.fan. That's our Discord. You can come hang out with us there. Justin said he's going to join. I heard him say it. And, of course, you can be back here every week on Thursdays for YouTube Live at Bret.live, that little link at the top there. On Thursdays, every Thursday. And if you want to support this show and everything related to it, you just go over to Patreon. I have memberships. You don't have to pay for membership. That's just simply a way to thank the show and keep it running. We're now over 100 paying patrons, so I really appreciate all of you. If you don't want to pay and you want to get all of my updates on open source, everything I'm creating in open content and open code, you can click the follow button, which is free. It's kind of like your own private Twitter feed just about what I'm doing. It's not about me sharing links and all that kind of stuff we see on social media. It's really just about what did Bret make for me today, essentially. You can go click that follow button, or you can sign up for one of those packages, get some extra benefits. Justin is on Twitter, just like we saw there. You got a homepage, which I forgot to pull up. Sorry about that. But you can probably just look for Justin's Twitter handle and find his homepage, which he has some blog articles, especially one recently this year, which detailed his whole breakdown of his remote setup. It was a very long and detailed, awesome post. I love blog posts that go into detail. I'm going to look it up real quick.
I've got to update that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. It's a moving target. It's a moving target.
Yes.
And do you have your website link? You do. Okay, yeah, it's on your Twitter. All right. So, yeah, he has. This very detailed setup on his nice little home office, which I think that's a very minimalistic. I love minimalistic setups.
It's a bit less minimalistic now. It's got a bit more. It's got a bit more since then, but yeah.
Well, this is pre M1, right? This is pre ARM. So we have pre ARM world.
This was the first bit of lockdown, yeah, before the.
Yeah, I feel like we're gonna have we can really look back at this time and say there was a pre M1 and a post M1 world, because I have a feeling now we're gonna see more Microsoft ARM action happening, even though they've been doing it for years, like making better hardware out of that, sort of trying to level up the game. That's a prediction, but there's actually a great video, by the way, if we want to go down this rabbit hole as a signing off for everyone. There's this great video that I saw a year ago. I think it was like a year. Actually, it was a year and a half ago. It was when we released the Node.js course for Docker, and it was right around the time that Docker and the ARM partnership happened, right, where you announced the formal relationship of Docker and ARM, and how Docker is going to be like the best place to develop for ARM, even when you're on Intel, blah blah blah. It was really great. So anyway, in that course, I added at the very end, because it was right after that announcement, I added this little section on, oh, by the way, if you're on Node.js and you want to develop on ARM, you don't got to change anything. This is how you do it. It was it's like, you don't have to go buy a bunch of Raspberry Pis, but you can. You just don't have to. And when I was doing that research, I stumbled on a video from an architecture expert at Azure. Not to throw Microsoft under the bus or anything, but there's a guy that basically helps build the data centers for Azure, and he's doing a talk to like Microsoft partners or something at the Microsoft Partner Conference. And he basically, you could quote the guy as saying, we do have some ARM servers in the data center, but they're not really for customers, because a customer would never need or want to use an ARM server. Like, this is really just for our infrastructure boutique use. This was right around the time that Amazon had launched their ARM architecture servers, and everyone was going, because it was an older architecture that was slower, and I did the cost performance analysis, and it wasn't that different, so I didn't.
Well, the Amazon built those for use in their internal infrastructure. And then they rolled them out to customers later. That was exactly the way it happened.
But I got a feeling that guy's not saying that anymore at Azure. Like, probably not saying we're never going to have ARM for customers, because why would you want that? Anyway, I just saw today, by the way, that I guess AWS is now going to have Macs to build on, which Mac VMs in the cloud, to me, it sounds awesome. Like, thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we use Mac Stadium for doing our Docker for Mac builds, and they've always been awesome. We've used them for many years. Originally, we had a bunch of machines in the corner of the office in Cambridge, but having them at Mac Stadium means we could scale out CI to much more, because we have all the different OS versions, and now gonna have to have ARM versions and things like that. So they've been really great. But yeah, they were
that's
kind
cool.
of the only choice, and now there's Amazon's a choice as well, which is.
Do you know if they were VMs, or if they were actually like stacking up Mac Minis?
Everyone has to stack up Mac Minis, because that's the licensing requirements. That's why it's so hard to get a Mac Mini.
Because of all the clouds.
Amazon's bought them all.
Well, I thought they said virtual machines, though, which to me would mean that they somehow.
No, they're bare metal. They're all bare metal.
What? That sounds crazy to me. It sounds crazy. I mean, on Amazon scale, like, that sounds crazy to buy a bunch of Mac Minis. Like, that's like, surely Apple could like do something. I mean, can you imagine like Apple just developing a server board just for the cloud of Mac? That's all up, but designed on their M1 processor that they're manufacturing, instead of some other manufacturer designing ARM chips for the cloud. And it's now Apple Silicon technically running in the clouds like that. Which is what's happening now, but it's just, Mac Minis aren't really cloud friendly. Each one of them has their own power supply, and it's not ideal when you're talking about millions of servers. But anyway, this is always great. You and I can talk forever. And we need to wrap it up. So thank you. Thanks for being on, man. It's great chatting with you.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So next time next time we meet, we're gonna have the CI/M1 discussion, and see where it goes. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Have a great holiday, and I'll see you in chat. See everybody. Cool. See you in chat.